Welcome to Devon and Cornwall User Group. Today we have a really exciting session for you. We have Antony Catella, who's going to be telling us all about field parameters. It's a really good presentation. Also, to draw your attention to Data Relay, which is happening next week, 5 cities, 5 days. I'm presenting at 3 of those sessions and really looking forward to it. These are the sessions that are coming up. Please check out the Devon and Cornwall meetup group, and you can then click and you'll get the link to be able to join. Our next session is with Brian Julius, and it's all about offset and making those time intelligence functions disappear. Some really, really good sessions. So without further ado, let me hand over to Antony, who will talk to us all about field parameters.
Can people see my screen? That's a key thing. Great.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Right, so everybody can see my screen. That's the good start. Right, let me crack on here. Right, so what I'm wanting to do is sort of explore field parameters. It's a bit of a sort of open sort of ended topic, if you want to call it that. But there's a reason for sort of calling it, just sort of looking at exploring it. About myself, I work as a BI consultant for a consultancy in the UK. Most of the time I'm working with non-profits, so that's where my expertise is. Love Power BI, also love my mountain biking, and I also love my baking, which I know Matthew also enjoys. That's my LinkedIn contact details. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, drop me a message. So yeah, quite happy to if you've got any questions and stuff, drop me a message on LinkedIn. So let's crack on here. So what we've got is that I've brought in some data from the really ubiquitous Contoso database. What I've done is I've aggregated the data in the SQL database, and what I've got is I've got 2 fact tables, one which is just looking at attributes associated with the customers and attributes associated with the sales data. On the customers table, we've got 5 dimension tables attached to the customers, the fact customers table, and I've got 3 dimensions attached to the sales table. Now, what I've also done is, if I just go through very quickly on this side here, is that I've got, for the customers side of things, I've created 4 measures for customers, and for the sales, I've also created 5 measures for the fact sales. And I'll get to these ones later on, so at least I've got some measures to work with. So that's where our starting point is within the data set. Now, this sort of gets us on to, well, how would we visualize this data? So you get to the situation where the report user says, well, can you create visuals for all the permutations in the current data model? So you sort of go, well, yes, well, of course I can. But then you've now got the situation of where in the customers table, I've got 4 measures. I've got potentially 5 dimensions on the legend, 5 dimensions on the x-axis. So your potential permutations is you've potentially got 100 different variations of this exact same chart on the right-hand side for the customers table. And for the sales table, you've got 5 measures, 3 dimensions for the legend and 3 for the x-axis. So you potentially have got 45 different variations for those particular entities. Now, this is quite a nice basic data model that I've created. So you can well imagine that most production models, you're going to have a lot more permutations that you might have to get. So this leads us on to field parameters. So field parameters allow users to dynamically change the measures and all the dimensions being used in visuals within the report. So obviously you're going to have certain report users who are going to want to explore the data in one way on looking at one dimension and a few one measure and a few dimensions, and you're going to get report user B who's going to say, no, I want to look at it in a slightly different way. This is where field parameters is really, really useful to do that. And it makes your report design a lot simpler. Instead of thinking of, well, I don't want to create 100 different charts on the page. Let me try and see if I can simplify that. Now, to use field parameters, surprisingly, they are still in preview. So they came out last year, August. So if you're wanting to turn on field parameters, is that if we go to the file, options and settings, and then under options, there's a section called preview features. So under preview features, and if you select this option for field parameters, if you select that, press OK and come out of there, it may ask you to restart Power BI Desktop, restart it, and then you'll have the option to create field parameters. So now what we're going to do is any questions at the moment before I jump on to the next one? If you want to...
Fernando had a question, Anthony. I wanted to know why you considered customers as a fact table.
So the prime reason that we had done it this way is for customers, is that it was all based on a project that I'd worked on, where we ended up with a huge amount of data coming in from loads of different clients or organizations, in actual fact. And in each of those organizations, they had, some of them had hundreds of thousands of customers. Some of them had, 1 million customers, in actual fact. And the whole idea behind it was that we wanted to create a report that people could analyze their data and say to us, yes, this is the amount of records that we are expecting in the data set that you've received, side of things. So, for example, if we've received a data set that has got, 5 million sales transactions and a data set that's got 1 million customer records, we wanted to provide a facility that, based around those customers, what are the attributes associated with those customers? What are the attributes associated with those sales transactions? And so this is the reason why I've created an aggregated set of data based on the customers, and why I've created it as a fact table. And the same thing for the sales transactions, is because we wanted to create them as two separate entities, but we wanted to analyze those particular tables separately to basically see, is the data correct in the first instance? So it's almost a way of checking the data quality that you're actually getting. So that's why I created them as two separate fact tables.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Anthony.
Right, so let's get on to using them. So this is now what I would say is, if we go back to that original sort of statement of where we had multiple different dimensions. So in this particular instance is that, so I'm wanting to make just my number of customers measure. I'm wanting to be able to flip that around on my chart. So without having to create I've just got a dynamic x-axis in this example here. I don't want to create 6 different charts. I can use field parameters on the left-hand side, and it'll just switch around on my x-axis. So, for example, I can switch out what was my first purchase month, for example. So I had a certain number of customers whose first purchase or first sales was in January all the way through. I might want to see it, how does it work by first purchase year? How is it that I might want to look at it as, based on gender, etc. So within 6 dimensions here, I can have one chart and dynamically change that x-axis for those 6 particular dimensions. So if we now get on to, so that's what we're trying to do to get to this, to the next stage. So now, how do we go about creating these field parameters? So I've created a page here where I've got just a chart of the number of customers. And so what we're wanting to do is create a field parameter. So what you need to do is, if you go to the modeling tab, under modeling, under the new parameter, there's an option there for fields. Now, if we click the fields option, it's going to bring up a dialog box here, which is going to say, what we wanted to do is give a name to our field parameter, which generates, what it does, it creates essentially a DAX table within your data model. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create this, and I'm going to create this just as a dimension parameter. I like to put underscores in because then it'll force it to go right to the top of my onto the data window on the right hand side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag in a few dimensions into here. So I'm going to drag in the gender, I'm going to drag in the marital status, and then I'm also going to drag in the occupation into here as well. And then what we also had earlier, we also had the birth year. So I'll drag in the birth year. So I've now got 4 dimensions in there. And there's an option down at the bottom here, which says add slicer to this page. So you can turn that off if you don't want it to auto-generate the slicer for you. In this instance, I'm just going to leave it turned on. So what'll happen is it'll go away, create my field parameter table, and I've now got my my slicer on the left-hand side here, which it's auto-generated, and I've got my four different dimensions in here. So that's the field parameter table, and that's the slicer that I'm going to use. Now, what I'm wanting to do is drag that onto the visual. So if I then now, on the right-hand side here, it has gone, what Power BI has done is it's gone and generated a DAX table up at the top here, which I called underscore dimension parameter. Now, what Power BI will do is it'll create a column with exactly the same name as what the table name is, called underscore dimension parameter. That'll be the name of the column that will be used on the visual itself. Then it also creates another column called dimension parameter fields, which is the actual name of the field or the table. So where the table that it actually came from, that particular dimension that we're going to use. And then the dimension parameter order is, if I show people here, so what you've got here is that you've got the dimension parameter, which is the name that you're going to use on the visual. Now we'll go.
Sorry, Anthony. Would you be able to zoom in just a little bit? Can you do it by?
What I could do is, it doesn't want to zoom in. Quick way of zooming in.
You can usually do. I usually just change the display resolution, but I think you Control Shift and Plus. Will that make it a bit bigger for you?
If I do the resolution on my screen,
or probably not best to do that.
Not at this
Shift
stage.
And Plus.
Let me do Control Shift and Plus. Try that option and see what happens there. Control Shift and why is that? Whenever you want to
Windows Plus. Alan's telling us Windows Plus.
Can you try Control and mouse wheel?
Yeah, Control and mouse. Sometimes it doesn't work in Power Query.
There we go. Can you see that now?
No.
Not.
I can read it. Okay. I think Anthony was having some issues with the Windows Plus.
I was having issues with the resolution side of things earlier. So what I'll do is try, is that any better? Doing it that way?
Yeah. If you use Control and hold the mouse key, is that going to bring it bigger for you?
No, it's not doing anything on my side.
No. Okay, not to worry. We'll keep going.
Cool.
But thank you everyone for your tips.
Right. So what ends up happening is, what we've got. So like I said, is the first column is the name of the field that's going to appear within the visual itself. The second column is the name of the table where it actually comes from. So whether it's a dimension or it's a measure. And then the third column is the order in which you want those dimensions to appear within any slices. So, for example, this one here at the moment is that by default, the order in which you drag them onto it will automatically number them. So everything's numbered from 0 through to 3. Now, it doesn't have to start from 0. You can You can start it from 1 if you want. You can start it from 10 and go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 if you want. So for example, in this, and you can amend these numbers later on, which I'll show later on. So if I just go back to my page here, is that what I've actually got in the visual. So what I'm actually going to do is that if I go into the visualizations here, and I go and drag the dimension parameter onto the x-axis now. So what will happen is that on here, I can now actually, I've now got my slicer up at the top here, and I've now got that field being dragged onto the visual. And I can now flip around depending on what I'm wanting to do in the slicer, and it changes it dynamically just as it was doing in the page just before it. So that's how easy it is to actually create field parameters. Now, they're very easy to create, and it makes life a lot simpler within your Power BI report. You don't have to create. I did see something in about disconnected tables. I've done it with disconnected tables in the past. It is you've got to create the disconnected tables. You've then got to create different switch statements within your measures, which you can do. And you've got to do a whole lot of other interesting aspects to actually try and get it to work. Whereas in this here, literally natively within 5 minutes, I've been able to create a field parameter and added it onto my visual. Any questions on that side of things before we jump into the nice meaty stuff?
No questions.
Cool.
All quite happy.
Right. So what I've done is here so let me show you what I actually have done with the data before and within this Power BI report. So what we've got here is that we've got a matrix here. We've actually got a measure slicer up at the top here with all 4 different measures that we might want to visualize on the visual itself. We've then got a legend slicer. So we want to be able to, so this is the column header on this particular matrix. So this is all the different dimensions that I might want to show on this particular matrix. In the bottom here, I've got another slicer for the x-axis, or the rows. Now, I know people have said, well, why are you duplicating the dimensions between the legend and the row? The whole idea behind this is to make it as flexible for the user as possible. Now, you might have a user who wants to view it to put gender on the legend or column versus somebody who might wants to put gender on the x-axis or row element of the actual visual. So that's the idea behind it, is it gives people full flexibility to whichever way they want to view the actual data itself. Now, in this instance here is that, as you can see, is that I've got all the measures, all the legends, all the x-axis permutations, and people can do those 100 different permutations that they want all in one visual. So I've gone from 100 visuals down to 1 visual. Or you can say technically 100 visuals down to 4 visuals, because I've got the 3 slices on the left-hand side to allow people to dynamically change the actual matrix itself. Now, very similarly to the sales one, I've done a very similar thing as well, is where I've got the different measures at the top, the legend in the middle, and the x-axis as well. And I've also got a matrix, and so people can move things about depending on what they're wanting to do. So, for example, I can remove the product category. I can change the column to view it as at the product subcategory level. I could change it around. I might want to look at it at the purchase month level on the column, and rather have promotion name on the x-axis, or I'll swap it around and do purchase month on the left-hand side. Same with the measures. I might want to switch the measures around and get rid of order lines and rather just have the orders and the total sales amount, depending on what people are wanting to view within their data. So it allows a lot more flexibility for people to be able to do that. And particularly in our situation where we were wanting to check the quality of the data that people were supplying. So at least it gave them full flexibility to be able to look at their data in whatever lens they decided they wanted to do it. Now, one of the things that I did want to point out is that in the filters on the right-hand side here, I've actually got a filter on the page where I've got an attribute which is called sale. And the same thing with customers. I've also got an attribute called customer as well. Now I'll get to the reasoning behind that when we get into the next section of the report. So this is a sort of setup that I was aiming for. So let's see, right, how do you do this? How do you edit the field parameters? How do you actually get it so you can do all this sort of manipulation within the actual visual itself? So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to first of all show people that this is what you can also do, is that you can actually create a data model and link the different field parameter tables together, because they're a table within your report, and you can actually link them together and create a data model based on those field parameter tables. So very briefly is that what I ended up doing is that I had one field parameter table that held all the measures. And now, so when I say all the measures, this was the measures for all the customer fact table and the sales table. I had all the different dimensions for both the fact customers and the sales. I had exactly the same for the x-axis option side of things for the customers and sales. What I then also had, what I've also got is I've got 3 bridge tables to link the different field parameter tables. And then these 3 bridge tables is what I'm just calling a link table up at the top side of things. So this link table was just a row measure legend table that I created so I could link the three different entities together. And that creates me a data model that I can use to filter the different pages within the report and filter the different slices as well. So how did I get to this sort of data model? So what I'll first of all do is, so what I needed to do was to edit the field parameter tables. So I'll show you how you can easily do it with the actual one that we created earlier. So this is the one that we've actually created earlier on. So for example, in here is that I can easily go in here and actually can go and create another column in here. So for example, is that I'm wanting to create a flag in this particular table that will indicate that this dimension belongs to the actual, is linked to the customers table. So what I'm going to do is just assign it a value of 1. So if I just go in here, modify here, and do exactly the same thing on this particular row as well, add another 1, and in this particular one, also add a 1, and I commit the changes. What will happen is it'll create a column which is just called value 4, because that'll be the 4th column that it creates. And I can go into there and I can just go and rename it. So for example, in here, I'm just going to rename it to customer. So I've now got a column called customer, and that's been flagged up with a 1 in it. So all these particular dimensions are ones that are associated with the customer fact table. So the other way that I can also modify this, if I'm wanting to, is I can easily go and it's just a DAX table. I can copy that down, create that, add it at the bottom here, and I can then just go and create this as another dimension. So for example, in here, I might want to add in, so earlier on, I had the purchase. I also used the purchase here. So if I'm just wanting to go in here, I can go and add in, amend it, create the purchase here. It's coming from the calendar purchase table, and it's going to be the purchase here. And that's now I've gone and created it, modify the row order number. So I've now got a modified parameter table, and there it is at the bottom. Now, the beauty of this as well is that you can go in and change the names of the first column. So for example, I might not want to call it purchase here. So in the instance for the customers, I called it first purchase here, even though I've got a a field called purchase year in the calendar table. I can give it whatever name I'm wanting to within here. And this is what will appear on the charts when I drag this particular column into the actual visual itself. This is the name that will actually appear. Yeah. So that's our table that I've created. So or edited rather. So if I go back to our demo page that we created, our slicer, it's gone automatically added that extra field to the slicer, and I can automatically just change the slicer, and we've got the first purchase here now that appears on the x-axis. So it's a very simple thing to go and add an extra column into there. Whereas if I had, again, going back to the disconnected table, you'd have to go into Power Query, create another field, go and do your changes to your switch statements, etc. Here, I've literally done it very, very easily and very quickly. So that's in terms of editing the field parameter table. Now, what I did is, so to make things a bit quicker, is that what I'm going to do is just show the layout of how I created the layout of all the different tables that I created. So in the particular legend table that I've got all the dimensions that I'm using that are all connected to the customers table and to the sales table. I've got a legend order for this particular table. I've got a column in here that flags up which table that dimension belongs to, be it the customer table or the sales table. And I've just added in a 1 in here to indicate which one it belongs to. And the other thing that I've also done, which I'll get on to explain why later on, is that at the end of the table, I've also created a calculated column called legend, which is just an exact replica of the first column itself. And there's a reasoning for this, which I'll get onto a bit later on. Now, the other thing as well is that people say, well, why didn't I just number the legend order here from 1 through to whatever it is, 11 rows? There was a reasoning for having a separate sort of sequence of numbers, so to build my data model. So I've got a separate sequence of numbers for the legend table. If I open up the measures table, I've got a separate sequence of numbers for the measures table, and I've got yet a separate sequence of numbers that I used for the actual x-axis table. So that's the basic setup of those. If I go back to the measures table, the other thing that you can also do is that what I ended up doing as well is I created another column here called type, which is just another indication here. So what I wanted to do is you can add who knows how many different columns that I haven't run yet into a situation where I've exceeded how many columns I want for the particular task that I was trying to do. So for example, in this situation here is that I wanted to identify what measure is an absolute value. So when I say absolute, is just a total whole number side of things, or what is a measure that is a ratio. So for example, average number of sales amount per customer, or average order lines per order, or average sales amount per order. Because part of the exercise that I was wanting to do was that I wanted to create a 100% column chart. Now, obviously, a 100% column chart makes no sense at all to drag a ratio measure onto it. So I wanted to find an ability to be able to, within my visuals itself, is control. If somebody selected a ratio measure, it would come up with a message in the 100% column chart to say, you've selected a ratio measure, it will not be displayed within the column chart. Whereas for absolute measures, it would be displayed. I also had you could also add in here is to say, do I want to put another flag in here to indicate what is a number field and what is a currency field? Because you might want to have a situation where you actually display the currency code in the front of your currency values. You may be dealing with multiple currencies. So you may want to set up the system where you want to show USD or euros or whatever currency you might want to show. So you can add multiple different columns to your field parameter tables. Any questions on those before I get to the other table, which was the sort of link table that I talked about earlier?
No questions, just lots of lively chit chat in the chat about what you're showing us.
Cool.
All positive.
Right, good.
Yeah.
Now, the other one that I also wanted to show people was this link table that I created. So the link table, which is the one up at the top of the data model, which essentially which was a union of all the different columns. So what I've done is that I've taken the x-axis field parameter table. I've created a column called order, and I've taken the row order from that field parameter into this table here. I've also then created a column called attribute, and so I wanted to assign that to be customer. And the attribute value is associated with the customer column that I showed people in the field parameters table. Exactly the same for sale. I did exactly the same thing, whereas I've got an attribute called sale, and then I've repeated that for the 3 different field parameter tables. And then I've done a filter at the bottom here to filter that out to only show me the various dimensions and measures that have got a 1 associated with them in this particular table. And this is one of the prime reasons why I created separate order numbers in each of the different tables. So you've got a distinct number for each of the different options. So when you actually go back to the actual data model itself that I created here, is that when you link the bridge table to the link table up at the top here, is that I'm linking it only on the particular number that was associated with the measures, and not linking it across. I'm not trying to use the same number in 3 different tables, because I've tried and get it to work. It failed miserably because you're using the same number. Whereas if you've got distinct numbers for each of those different options, you can then do this filtering within the actual report itself. So, which is where, if I then show people very quickly this is this attribute that I was talking about earlier, where you've got customer and sale. So on each page, I was then able to filter it out. So I can filter out all the measures, legends, and x-axis, so it only shows any of those associated with the customer. Likewise, on the sales, I can filter out so it only shows me the measures, legend, and x-axis values associated with the fact sales table. So that's
there's discussion in the chat. People want to dig deep into your data model, so they're asking whether you'd be able to have a look at the PBIX when you finish. But you'd be happy to share it, because
I can show that one.
I think we're all sort of like, wow, I hadn't thought of doing this. So there's a real interest in understanding how the model's working. That's fine. I'll let you continue, but there's lots of praise for you in the window.
So anyway, so you've got your data model here. You've got I set it up with a bidirectional between the link table and the bridge table for each of them. And there was obviously a reason that you could go backwards and forwards between the two, because that was the only way I was able to get it to work. And then I've got the bridge table then with a one-to-many to each of the field parameter tables. Because at the end of the day, is that in the link table at the top here, you would normally end up with only a one-to-one relationship between your order, which is, as I said earlier, was the row order, and those are the numbers that I actually ended up linking between the relationships. But I'll share the PBIX afterwards with people, and they can play around with it afterwards. So that's how I got to creating my data model that was able to do all the fancy filtering of all the different options. So at the end of the day, is that you've gone to a setup where I could have actually created very easily. I could have gone and created 3 separate field parameter tables just for the customers table. I could have created 3 separate field parameter tables just for the sales table. Now, in my instance, is that in the scenario that I was working with, is that I had 3 different fact tables that we were doing data quality analysis on. So in theory, I could have ended up with having 9 separate field parameter tables. And I thought, why do I want to do that? Why not just combine them all into just have 3 field parameter tables and just use the columns within those field parameter tables and create a data model for myself? Any further questions on the model there, Sue, before we jump on to the other?
No, I just had a question. It was from me. It was just trying to understand. Did the people that were using it, were they able to understand the logic and interact with the report quite easily?
Yeah, they loved it. The feedback that we had was that we have not had one person who didn't understand what was actually happening.
Great.
And how they used it.
Lovely. Brilliant. I'll let you carry on. You're at 6:20.
Yeah, cool.
6:40. You've got 20 minutes.
That's fine.
6:40, 20 minutes.
Cool. Right. So the next thing that I wanted to get onto is, if I show you here, is that on each of the visuals itself is, if I just close that out, just zoom this out a little bit here, is in the title of the actual visual here, is that I've got a dynamic title up at the top here. I've also got what I've created as a measure definition. So for each of the different measures, I've also got a dynamic definitions for each of the measures that I've actually got within the data. So if I look at the title side of things, first of all, is that I've set it up that I can change that title so it'll be dynamic just depending on what options I've selected. So for example, if I don't select anything on the X row, it's going to change over and it'll say, and 3 or more X-axis row dimensions. If I change, and you can see here is that the legend option is coming up in the title as first purchase here, and whatever your measure is that you've selected will come up in the title as well. So if I go and change the setup, is that I can change this over so your title just goes dynamic again, and I can also add the measures. Now what will happen is, if you, in this particular instance, is what I've done is I've set up in the DAX code that it'll show multiple measures. If more than one measure has been selected, it'll show multiple measures by the different selections that you've made for the legend and row, and the measure definition will come up saying definition will only be displayed when only one measure is selected. Now this is where the definitions table, if I just show people very quickly, is if I go back to my data model that I created, is I linked a measure definitions table in my relationships to my measure table. So it's a one-to-many relationship. At the moment, it'll be essentially you've got a one-to-one relationship there. So the measure definitions is that I went and created a separate data table. You could actually create all your definitions within your field parameter table if you wanted to, but I decided to create a separate measure definitions table, which is actually located in SQL, that people can actually update it in SQL, and then it'll feed back into the Power BI report, and it's using exactly the same. If I look here at the measure definitions here, it's using exactly the same order number that comes from the field parameter table, which again is a distinct number. The same order number, as I said earlier, is coming from my measure table. So if I show the measures table, I've got the same ones, 1 through to 9, which is also in my measures definition, and I've linked that through to the actual in the data model itself. So the title becomes dynamic depending on what you've selected. Now, one of the things that you do have to be careful of with using field parameters is, and I've got a couple of links at the end, is that if you use selected value on the actual, this first column that gets generated when you create a field parameter table, you will end up with it'll generate an error. So this is what I say on the visible column of the table. So what will happen is you'll actually end up with an error if you try and use selected value on that particular column. And that was the prime reason why I created another column, calculated column at the end, which I just called legend name, which is exactly the same as the first visible column, if you want to call it that. So that's the first thing to be aware of. Now, there is an alternative option where you can also use...
We have got a question, if you want a question.
Yeah.
It's just wondering if the measure description could be leveraged to populate the table.
Which one here? The measure description?
Yeah. So, you know, the measure description, the measure definition,
yeah.
The legend name, whether you could use that to populate the table.
Which table?
The table in the report.
You can actually use, you can't use this is the one that actually gets used in the report.
Carrying on writing. Yeah. Hang on, they're giving me more information. As well as giving me grief, Anthony, that I'm making you finish on time.
Oh, that's fine. You know, so, deal with it.
They're loving you, but giving me grief. Don't you worry about it. A C# script might do it. It's yeah. So you carry on. Don't worry. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you go back to here, the other option is you can also, alternatively, you can use select columns, summarize and count rows, as well as concatenate X with the auto-generated columns. So when I say the auto-generated, these are the field parameter auto-generated columns. Now, this was something that I learned from the SQL BI. They were the ones who pointed out about the selected value generating an error, and these were the alternative options to using this code. Or what I ended up doing is creating a duplicate version so I could still use selected value. So if I just go and show people very quickly is the DAX that was generating all of these. So if I go down into the measures table here, so if we look at the so what I've done first of all is in terms of the measure selection here. So what I've got here is where I'm using that methodology, using the select columns side of things to use the auto-generated columns, because I did try and do it on a couple of the other columns, the one that I created in the calculated column, and I couldn't get this to work. So I went back to using the auto-generated fields, and it worked absolutely spot on. So basically what you've got is you've got to select columns, summarize based on those auto-generated columns. What I've also found is that it'll also always come up with an error, thinking as though that column doesn't exist. I've always found this, and it always happens. And I don't know, it's just the way that Power BI, they obviously haven't sorted that out within the desktop software. And then what it's doing is that it's then counting the number of rows. So if anything is greater than 1, it'll come up saying multiple measures in the title. If not, it'll concatenate them, or I could have just done selected value, because in this situation, I could have done it where I was doing it greater than 2 measures. And then you can do the concatenate X here. So it'll concatenate X. It'll concatenate if you've selected 2 measures together. Or I could have just gone the route of just gone selected value up at the top here. But this is what I had in place, and this is what I was using, because I had situations where I was actually using 2 measures. You could allow 2 measures to be selected in the actual visual. In terms of the measure definition lookup, that was a very simple thing of where I set it up that if you've got a measure selection count which is equal to 1, then it'll show the measure definition. If it's not, it'll then come back with an alternative text to say 1 has not been selected. And all I did was up at the top created a variable where it was just taking the max of the actual definition from the definitions table. And that's how simple the DAX measure was for this particular one. And then the measure selection count, I was just doing a SUMX distinct on the actual measure name. So this is the calculated column that I've created, because I couldn't get it to work on the auto-generated column. So I had to get it to, I got it to work on the actual calculated column that I'd created. And then this will give me a count of how many measures have actually been selected from the slicer. And that's basically what I ended up using to then generate all the dynamic titles that you get at the top here, and the dynamic measure definitions within here. Now, one of the things that I have found before with creating new visuals is that you can actually get it. If you first of all create your slicer and you create your chart and you drag your field parameter column, the field name onto the visual, the title does become dynamic. But what becomes interesting, though, is that as soon as you go into the actual title, into the title area of your actual chart itself, so by default, as at the moment, it's set up to be conditionally formatted to change over. But if I remove that, what it'll do is it'll auto-generate a title in that text box. But as soon as you go into that text box, as soon as you click into that text box, it loses that dynamic nature of your title. And so what will happen is that, for example, if my first option I selected was customers, number of customers, it'll stay number of customers, doesn't matter what other measures you actually select, which is why I went the route of creating the dynamic titles using measures side of things. So that's in terms of I'll fix this afterwards, the dynamic titles. Any questions on those before we get on to the last couple of bits, which I know I'm running out of time, Sue?
Yeah, you got a couple of minutes. No, just interested, lots of interest. I've popped in the article for SQL BI about selected values so people can see that. I think people just want to, have a look, but I will let you finish so that you can finish on time.
Cool. Just a couple of limitations that I have found with them is AI visuals and Q&A. It won't work with those. You cannot use them in a live connection mode because you do need a local model so you can create the field parameters. But you can do it, obviously, if you create a composite model, you can then create the field parameters table. And also you cannot use it with implicit measures. You do need to create the explicit measures and use the measures within those explicit measures within the field parameters table that you've created. Just some useful links. Top one is for people who haven't, want to go back to the Microsoft Learn to learn about field parameters from there. The selected value function in terms of more details, that's the link to the SQL BI website. And then there's also another link here that I've also added, which is also looking at the variations between switch statements, using switch statements, disconnected tables, using calculation groups, using field parameters, pros and cons of the different options. So that's another link that I found has been quite useful. I still need to try and play around a lot more with that. I found field parameters, you can use calculation groups, but field parameters is so much quicker and easier to actually implement, and particularly for somebody who's new to the Power BI world. So that's it. Thanks very much, Sue. Finished on time.
Look at you go. Well done. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. I think that there's been so much, there's lots of applause and clapping and everything going on. So this is one of the first times that Antony is presented professionally. I'm correct, aren't I, in an environment like this? And you smashed it, mate. Absolutely smashed it. It was brilliant, really interesting, very clear. And lots and lots of dialogue in the chat talking about how you did things, and people would really like to have a look at the model and just have a play. So a huge well done. Question from Fernando, because I know he'll give me grief if I don't ask you. Have you tried to set up drill through with field parameters? He tried about a year ago and it wasn't possible.
Not did I did not quite. No, I couldn't get drill through to work, but what I did was using a tooltip. I ended up creating a hidden synced slicer on the actual tooltip page for it to show like the measures, but I haven't been able to get the drill through to work either, so I need to play around with that more.
Brilliant, lovely. So yes, if you can share the report with me, Anthony, then I will send it out and email it to everybody that attended, if you're all happy for me to do so. Well done, it's absolutely brilliant. So I'm just going to take over the screen very quickly, and then I will finish. So thank you, Anthony, that was brilliant. So you should be able to see my screen okay. So just to remind you that in 2 weeks' time, Tuesday the 17th of October, so 3 weeks' time, we've got Brian Julius, who will be showing us all about DAX offset magic. His presentations, you just learn something completely all the time. And then after that, we have Christy and I think Michael. I'm not sure whether Michael's doing it at the same time or another session, but anyone that's watching that hasn't had any experience of presenting, please just reach out and get in touch if you'd like to have that option, and I'm happy to spend a little bit of time with you beforehand to enable you to practice, because I think I'll let you unmute yourself, Anthony. I think we really did find it quite useful to be able to do that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. I would certainly second that option, is to go through it with Sue, because I found it very, very useful, and in actual fact changed the presentation quite substantially to what I'd originally envisaged. And so it also gives you thought processes of things not to sort of get yourself stuck into, or potential stuff to trip over, and also to make a nice sort of flow if you haven't had much experience.
Yeah. And it will work quite well, because sometimes when you're so busy, I know from presenting before, sometimes you can just be right in the weeds of it, and you need to having someone who steps outside it objectively just to give you that bit of you sort of talking through it, then that really does help. So please unmute yourself or share screens or whatever if there's anything anyone wants to repeat or ask questions of. But just to say thank you all for joining us. It's a real pleasure, and thank you, Anthony. I know you put a huge amount of time into that presentation. And Anthony just said he hoped at the beginning, before we started, he really hoped that everyone just came away with at least one thing that they've learned. So I know I certainly have, and given me food for thought as well. So a huge thank you. I'll stop sharing and just hand it over to you guys, and or you people if you want to just unmute and chat for 5 minutes, and then we'll finish it off. So a big thank you, and I'll stop recording now.